Hello, and welcome to episode 38 of TBR, the To Be Read podcast, where we talk about the books we love and the topics that interest us. My name is Patrick Stemp, and as always, I have Michael Ronn and Jamie Maltman with me. How are you guys doing?
Great. How are you tonight, Patrick?
Good. And we are joined by guest author P.T. Hylton tonight. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So before we get started, tonight we're going to be talking about reading outside of our normal genres. And before we kind of jump into our roundtable, PT, do you want to kind of tell our listeners a little bit sort of about the stuff that you would normally read?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm traditionally I read a lot of I guess speculative fiction. So science fiction, fantasy, and a little bit of horror in there as well. And I do read quite a bit of crime fiction too, but lately I've been getting into a lot of YouTube videos and stuff like that on fantasy. So I've really been in the fantasy mindset for the last probably three or 4 months or so. So that's where my head's really been at. So yeah, this is mostly what I've been reading. But I'm excited to be here because I'm sure for you guys as well, it's like in your daily life you don't necessarily talk to as many people who are as passionate about books and stuff like that as you are. Like when you're out in the working world and stuff like that. So I'm excited to talk to you guys because I know you're just as passionate about books as I am, and excited to see where the conversation goes.
Cool. Yeah, you're definitely right. There's not enough people in our daily lives, I think, that read as much as we do. And I was stealing another look at your bookshelf there. I noticed you got Lexicon by Max Berry up there, so that's very cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that bookshelf. I love how you have it organized by color. I was just realizing that while you talk,
See, this is proof that you guys are my people. That you noticed that I had it organized by color. Good.
So let's do our round table, and we'll talk about what we've been reading over the past week. And Jamie, do you want to go first?
Sure. And I had to write this down because I had kind of a crazy week. I finished Assassin's Apprentice, the book one of the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and it's funny, that was a book where like the first 50% was like first 50-60% was good, solid, like first book in a fantasy series, and then there was a little bit of a slow bit, and then the rest of it was great, and I'm like, then I really liked the book in the end. Like I liked the way everything came together with all the different threads and all the callbacks to little stuff that she brought along, over the course of the book. So really enjoyed that and interested in reading more in the series, and I believe we might even be hearing more about that. We'll see, depending where the rest of the show goes. I also, one that I had out for a few weeks from the library was Neil Gaiman's Midnight Days, which is a collection of a bunch of his early comics that were sort of individual ones. So there's some Swamp Thing, there's one sort of tangentially related to Sandman. There was Constantine and just some different stuff. So that was kind of a mixed bag. Like I think I liked the Sandman one the best. The Constantine one was pretty good, and then the rest is kind of there. Which same thing. Like I found, like I love Neil Gaiman stuff, but when you read one of his anthologies, then it's always a mixed bag. So which is pretty par for the course with anthologies in general. There was I read a really quick short story for another author from Australia, Casper Beaumont, that I'll probably talk about when it comes out in next month sometime. I've read I, Night Angel by Brent Weeks, which is a very short, it's not exactly a short story, but it comes after his Night Angel trilogy, where he'd actually written it as a bonus for people that pre-ordered his Broken Eye, like his book in his next series. But it was kind of a first-person thing that was like his main character from the Night Angel series speaking in first person, which was different, and threatening torture to someone. So it's kind of an interesting take on something. And he even warns up front, he's like, this is probably the most disturbing thing I've ever written, and it's a short. And I woke up one night and I was supposed to be writing something else, and this was in my head, so I sat down and I wrote it out in a couple of hours in the middle of the night. And it kind of reads that way. I've continued reading that book, Whole Earth Discipline by Stuart Brand, that I mentioned that Hugh Howey was talking about it. And that was the one where he's talking about different disciplines within science that are going to need to get worked with in order for us to deal with climate change in a way that's non-catastrophic. And it's a really cool book because he's an environmentalist, ecologist that's been around, he's like 70-something. But he's actually talked himself into changing his opinion on things like nuclear energy or he was never against genetically modified foods, which, you hear so many people that are. I'm actually in that section right now, and man, the truth is like, yeah, I don't know.
Out there?
I come from a family where my mother is very into health stuff, and the stuff, the like cherry-picked studies that were used to get people freaked out about genetically modified stuff are really, like, he has a whole bunch of those, like, the most famous stories, and he's like, and here's the real story of what, how that was disproved like 3 weeks later, but environmentalists have run with it for the next, few decades. And he's an environmentalist himself, so it's really interesting. I honestly think everyone should read that book to sort of get a really good scientist perspective on all these different aspects of, so again, like, there's the urbanization, nuclear energy, now it's into, and then like biotech for farming, and then the next one is biotech for medicine, and then the last one is like rehabilitating the earth in different ways. But man, that book it's fascinating. I'm constantly sharing stuff with my wife as I read it, and my mom might read it, and I'm really interested to see whether it'll blow her mind or she'll just disbelieve a bunch of it. Mom, don't listen to this episode. I've been reading Rose, so Bone Zero, to my son. And that was a weird adjustment, which I know I know Michael said he was like, it's there, it's not part of it exactly. It's the thing that really struck me is it's visually so different because it's a different artist that did it, and it's a different lettering, and the font is horrible. Like it's really annoying to read, especially in bed, like to my son in like slightly low light. The story, like about halfway through, is actually not bad. Like I found it gets better once the dragons start showing. But so we're almost done that, and then I've just started on another fantasy book called Out of Darkness by Kat Caffey. It's a indie book about this guy that's being raised from a kid to be a gladiator and to try and earn a name. And there's some stuff. I'm only about like 10-15% of the way through, but pretty rough life for this kid, and he really had to learn how to talk from like just experiencing it with people. Like he had no language, nothing. So it's like it's a really interesting book where it's kind of almost like playing with the perspective of if you know absolutely nothing and you're starting to experience this like little window of life from the age of like 6 onward. So it's kind of a little bit disturbing, but interesting, and see where that goes from there. So yeah, that's a pretty busy week where I mixed in with a bunch of short stuff, so that's where I actually finish stuff. And man, someone else go.
PT, do you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Get much reading? Did you read as much as that this week?
I don't know if I can necessarily compete with that, but I'll give it a shot. So the first book I read this week, I have to thank you guys for, because it was Sawyer Jackson in the Long Land, which I heard about from you guys, and I read it and loved it. It was very good. So definitely recommend people check that out. I'll add my name to the endorsees along with you guys with that one.
And that's Kevin Tumlinson, for anybody who hasn't heard us talk about him before.
Good friend of the show.
Thank you. And the next book I actually just started, Jamie, was The Assassin's Quest, which is the third book in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. And I really liked the first 2 books. She's a really great writer. It's kind of different than the books I usually read. It's like more character-driven rather than plot-driven. I mean, there's plot stuff that happens, but she's definitely more interested in the characters and stuff like that, it seems like.
Yeah, it's very quiet as far as fantasy is concerned. Like there's not a lot of action-y stuff. Like it's not a bunch of people swinging swords and doing magic that's like really out there. Especially in the first book, it's like you're saying, it's a lot quieter, but there's crazy stuff going on in the background, and yeah, I'm impressed. So
yeah, I am a little nervous about this third book though, because it's like 750 pages. It's like twice as long, I think, as the first book. So we'll see. But I'll give it a shot. The next book I finished this week was The Magician King by Lev Grossman, which is the second book in his Magicians trilogy. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that at all, but that's it's kind of a guy who's he's a teenager and he's really obsessed with like magic and this land called Fillory, which is like these children books that are basically the Chronicles of Narnia, but like a fictionalized version. And when he's like trying to get into college, he finds out that magic is real, and he gets into this magical college. And the interesting part about the book is he's like kind of like a really depressed kid, and like he just keeps thinking, if only magic was real, I would be totally happy. And then magic is real, and I don't want to get spoiled the book, but I'm not sure that it solves all his problems. Let's just say that. Very interesting book. It's kind of been described a lot as Harry Potter for adults. It's it's got that magical school thing, at least in the first one, but it's a lot darker and a lot they're college kids, so there's a lot of more adult activity going on in it. So very interesting book. I like that a lot as well. And then the final book that I'm reading right now is Station 11, which is it's kind of a post-apocalyptic thing where the like 99.99% of the world's been wiped out by this flu epidemic thing, and we're following this like traveling Shakespeare company who's going around doing Shakespeare plays. And I'm not super far into it yet, so I'm not exactly sure what the story is exactly. So far, we're just kind of following these people around and having flashbacks to the time before the plague. So, but it's a very well written book, and I think it was like one of the Goodreads choice of winners this year or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I see that book on Amazon all the time. It's Emily St. John Mandel, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So I don't know if I'm far enough into it yet to say whether I like it or not. It's definitely very well written, but I'm not sure what the story is yet. So I don't know. We'll see. So
Okay.
that's about it for me.
Not bad. How about you, Michael?
Well, I had a pretty productive reading week this week. I finished American Gods, and so I was trying to cleanse my palate with a lot of shorter stuff. I've got this thing where I go through phases where I'll buy like a ton of books on my Kindle, and then they'll just sit, and then I just feel guilty about it. It's like I have to read all these books. So my campaign for now through the end of the year is to actually try to read all the books on my Kindle. Probably not going to happen, but I'm going to try. So I just went to the very beginning. The books at least on my Kindle, the way it works is the books at the very bottom are the ones that like I bought like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So I started a couple and wasn't that interested, and a lot of them happened to be classics. So I tried to read a book by Henry James and just couldn't get into it, and ended up on Mark Twain's Roughing It, which I'm not sure if you guys heard of that. It's like his nonfiction. It's like a semi-autobiographical account of his travels in the Wild West. So I guess like his brother was like the governor or assistant governor for the territory of Nevada back in like just before the Civil War, and so he talks about how he traveled from Hannibal, Missouri, all the way out to the West, and he gives these really interesting accounts of what life was like actually, like in the Wild West, and beautifully written, really, really funny. And I got the audiobook companion through WhisperSync, so that was really fantastic, but just really dense and kind of hard to find a point. As if you read anything by Mark Twain, he's kind of like the Mississippi River. He just keeps going and going and going, and just I guess I had a hard time with it. So I got about halfway through it and was like, okay, well, I'll probably find something else. And so then I jumped into How to Write a Business Plan by Ryan Petty, and it was an interesting book because this nonfiction, but it's geared toward writers and actually how to actually come up with a business plan. Sorry, my daughter is screaming her head off in the background if you guys hear it. But how to actually write a business plan, and he tailors it to authors, which I've never really seen a book geared toward authors this way. I mean, this guy's he was like an economics consultant, so he worked for all kinds of businesses, started a bunch of businesses, was an entrepreneur, so he really knows his stuff. And some of the points that he made in the book were really interesting, and would recommend that anyone who's interested in learning more about the business of being an author, I would recommend that you check that out.
Who's that by, sorry?
That's by Ryan Petty.
Ryan Petty, okay.
Yeah, it was released last year. I will say that the writing is a little dense, but it's the information there is still pretty good. And I've also been reading Marketing for Dummies, and that's by Alexander Hyam, I believe. And I just started that, but it's pretty interesting, and it covers marketing from a high-level concept. So just really, really basic stuff that I figure I need to learn. So that's kind of the stuff I'm getting through on my Kindle right now, and once I'm done with that, I'll get back to some more fiction. How about you, Patrick?
Well, I don't know. I think I might have you all beat. I think I read something like 20 books this week.
Holy cow.
Yeah, so, well, they were all, Dr. Seuss. So I
Oh,
picked up.
if you're gonna count those, if I need to count all the books I read to my kids this week, then yeah.
Well, I picked up a collection. It's called Your Favorite Seuss, and it's a collection of 13 of there's so many different collections out there and they all pick different books. This one's really interesting. It's got not an essay so much as just sort of a page from Stan and Jan Berenstain, John Lithgow, so all these different people who worked with or were inspired by Dr. Seuss over when they were kids, and so they write up a little blurb about that story or just about him as a person, if they knew him in real life, and it's a great collection. 13 stories. It included McElligot's Pool, If I Ran the Zoo, All the Places You'll Go, Dr. Seuss's Sleep Book, The Cat in the Hat, Horton Hears a Who, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, Yertle the Turtle, Happy Birthday to You, Green Eggs and Ham, The Sneetches, and The Lorax.
Nice.
So a lot of the big ones, right? As well as some of the other ones that were obviously well received, and just everyone's heard of the Grinch. Maybe not everyone has read the Sneetches. I don't think that there was any. Yeah, they're just amazing stories. I mean, he was just. I think the one that stood out for me the most, probably I read them all when I was a kid, but the one that I remember the most is the Happy Birthday one. For whatever reason, that book, I remember the images, I remember the story. Maybe it was just the one that was read to me the most when I was a kid. I don't honestly know, but so that was an interesting trip down memory lane to kind of bang through 13 books there of childhood memories. So it was a lot of fun.
I think it was last year I read that to my son. That particular collection. We've gone through pretty much any of them we can get our hands on at the library, and yeah, the one I gotta find is On Beyond Zebra, or Zebra, if you're American. On Beyond Zebra, I guess, but no. But that's one that I always like that I need to find. We just found that I can read with my eyes shut. My son was just reading that with me, which is cool too, because we're at that stage now. So, yeah, good stuff.
And that's and then the other book I kind of started diving into was Wonder Book, and that's one that's going to take a long time to get through. And I think it's extremely dense. Are you going to hold it up there? Is that what
I was going to, but I think it's downstairs. I have it downstairs because I wanted to reread part of it. Yeah.
And honestly, I can't remember the author's name offhand. Can you?
Jeff Vandermeer.
Okay. It's fantastic. It's all about maybe PT's grabbing his copy. Does he have one? There you go.
Oh man, I keep saying I'm going to buy this bok now.
It's so beautiful, and
it's so pretty.
It's even more beautiful than in real life, man.
I kind of wish. I'm sure there probably is a hardcover edition, and I kind of wish I'd got it because I don't like to crack the spine, and the soft cover is so heavy and thick and dense, and also the hardcover might be a little bit bigger because the text is also quite packed in some pages. It would be really nice to have those, and you could kind of open it up on the table and read it that way, whereas I find with soft covers that are that thick, you're really kind of curling the book open and trying not to crack that spine, and reading it this way, reading it that way.
Especially with the full layout images too, right? Like that really makes it tough sometimes.
Yeah. Just a gorgeous book, though, and I have a feeling that one's going to take me months to work through. It's not the kind of book you sit down on a Saturday afternoon and bang through it. You really kind of read a couple pages, let it percolate for a couple days.
Yeah. Every page you get inspired by something and you want to go right. Like that's how I felt about it anyway.
Yeah. So that was my week in reading.
Some comments, guys.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Quotidian Light is watching. Says, "Evening, Michael et al."
Hey, Maya.
And, Maya. And then John L. Monk is also watching. He says, "I organize my books by acid content of the paper."
Ooh, he's got us beat on that one.
Very clever. I just throw mine on the shelf. I don't even pay attention.
I just put mine in.
Is that it for comments?
Yep.
Okay, so we'll move on to our topic, which is reading outside of your normal genres. So, anybody have any sort of starting off comments? Get the conversation going?
Sure, I can say a couple things about it. I was thinking about this. So somehow I went through my whole life up till now, high school, college, everything, without ever reading Charles Dickens. And I'm not sure how that happened, but just like a couple months ago, I picked up Great Expectations and I read it, and I was like, hey, this is pretty good. Someone should have told me that Charles Dickens was a good writer. Why? My schooling has failed me. So then I was thinking about, I don't really ever read classics. And then, like, very shortly after that, I was reading I just picked up this historical book because it takes place in my part of the country. And I was reading it, and I was like, man, I usually don't like historical novels, but this is great. And then I was thinking, wait a minute, I'd never read historical novels. How do I know if I like them or not? So that kind of got me thinking, man, maybe there's some great genres out there that I would really like that I just don't ever dive into. So that got me thinking about this topic, I guess.
Yeah, I was thinking about my personal genres as well, kind of leading up to the show, and I read mostly science fiction, but I also read a ton of mysteries, thrillers, horror. Last year I read a couple books that I really enjoyed, The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry and The Rosie Project, which I guess you would just kind of classify those as general fiction, maybe. So I kind of feel like I read almost everything, but then, I'd like to read more westerns. I've read a few in the past, like Louis L'Amour, and this is a few years ago, and it's just when I made a conscious decision, like I need to read a couple books outside of the genres that I normally read. I would say that I have never, but could probably be talked into reading romance just for the just to see what the fuss is all about, I guess. And then it occurred to me that I would be more likely to read romance than I would epic fantasy.
I agree with that.
Just like this small. That's why.
Because, like a wimpy pod.
Yeah, but I think it's more because I think most of the genres that I read all of those genres have one thing in common, and that's that they're not epic. Right? They're whether they're action or character focused, they move along. They're not 1,000 pages. Sometimes they are. The Stand is a monster, and that's horror. That's Stephen King. But it's just that it's still moving along, right? It's not epic in the sense that some of the fantasy is, and so I'll leave that there. What about you guys, Jamie?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I was trying to think about this a little bit too, because I have dabbled out, at various times in the past few years too. Traditionally I've read mostly fantasy and historical fiction with a little bit of science fiction. But like you're saying, like The Stand, after reading on writing, then I got into that. I was check that out. But again, it's more the epic fantasy almost side of not epic fantasy, but it's a little bit more fantastical, disastery horror than it is, sort of the regular horror that Stephen King was made his early name in.
It's not Cujo. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's not it. And anything that I either saw the covers and got freaked out by when I was a kid, or saw the TV show or miniseries or whatever, some of these different things. Yeah, freaky. Anyway, but so I started to, I don't know, I haven't gone really crazy, but I did start to look at, like last year I started to look at some classic sci-fi and fantasy type stuff, or even just some of the things that came into that. From some, I think there was a Coursera course that was looking at classics in sci-fi and fantasy, and I sort of looked through the book list. Never took it because I'm like, I don't want to, commit to that many reads of stuff that I might not like or want to feel like reading. But that's when I read like the Island of Dr. Moreau, and that's when I read what's it called, Hylton, Stranger in a Strange Land. Mm-hmm. And I've been reading some of the Philip K. Dick, so I've been reading a little bit more sci-fi lately than I have been before. Another one that's I can't remember how I even came across deciding to read it, but when I went on my Haruki Murakami kick with starting with 1Q84, which is a massive sort of contemporary. Again, I can't remember exactly which fantastical, speculative sort of genre that is. But it's it's almost real world, but then weird stuff starts happening, and it's just a little it's just slightly out of phase, kind of that slight difference, and then there's some strange stuff happening with that. But so then I went on and read a bunch of his other books, which are mostly in that sort of setting. So I think I've been sort of broadening my horizons in some ways a little bit in the past couple of years, and really found a lot of stuff that I really like too.
I think it's funny too how you you just sort of reminded me of another genre. And I'm thinking about, sort of what is it that would lead you to read a new genre? And so the example for myself personally I was thinking of was when the video game L.A. Noire came out, or was about to come out. I got interested in that sort of as a genre and went and read everything I could get my hands on by Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, and had a great time reading those books. And that led me to Derek Raymond, I think his name is, who's the sort of, I think he's considered like the father of British noir, much darker than the American stuff. So I think you just, as readers, maybe you just kind of have to be open to those, experiences or thoughts like, hey, I've never read something like that. Maybe I should give it a try.
Yeah, this topic is really right up my alley. That's kind of like my stories. I love to read across genre. Like as a kid, like my uncle taught me how to read the encyclopedia. I know it sounds geeky, but
I totally
we'd have the 26 volumes, and I would pick a couple of them, and I'd lay them on the floor around me, and I would spin around until I got dizzy, and wherever I fell would be the one that I read, and then I would open it up, and then I would just turn to a random page and read about that, and that was the topic I'd read for the day. And so
I was going to say, who here is old enough to have experienced needing to do a project for school and doing it by going into the basement to the thousands of National Geographics that were shelved in the basement and cutting out pictures from those?
That's at my grandparents' house, but yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, he had National Geographic and either Science or Nature, one of the two, and Popular Mechanics, I think, as well.
Yeah. Well, it's good stuff. I mean, because you never know what you're going to get when you take that sort of an adventure. And so, like, now, to translate that into what I do now, it's, I go to the library and I just wander around the stacks and I just grab books off the shelf. I don't care who they're by or what the title is, and I just grab them and I read them. And if it sounds like it could even remotely be interesting, I'll take it home. Same thing with the Kindle. You can try sample on just about anything. So for me, I'm pretty adventurous. I'll read just about anything. Like when I first started my writing journey, I read stuff in translation. I read plays, poetry, science fiction, fantasy, mystery. I mean, for me, as long as it has a good story, and as long as the story, something actually happens, I don't really have a requirement, on that. I've really surprised myself with some of the stuff that I found, and there's nothing greater than finding something at the library or wherever you go, Like I found a book. I remember going to the library once, and I stumbled into the Japanese section, and I didn't think I would find anything there, and I just grabbed a book off the shelf, and it was Beauty and Sadness by Yasunari Kawabata, and probably one of the best books I've ever read to this day, probably in my top 10, And if I would have never set foot in that section, I would have never found the book, So I think it just boils down to being adventurous and wanting to grab something and knowing that probably most of what you read is probably going to be crap or not be to your taste. And it's that 1 out of 10 books that you read that makes it all worth it.
Well, and I think that's, if you're open to, reading stuff, reading new things, and you can use sites like Amazon and Goodreads and places like that. That's one of the things I love about those places is the recommendations they make. Like one of the great books I read a few years ago was The Killer Inside Me by Jim Thompson, about a homicidal sheriff living in the U.S., and he's more than a little psycho. But anyway, I think I was probably led to that from reading Dexter. Bit of a different character. He's definitely not the good guy, but when you might read Dexter and it says, well, if you like Dexter, this is the book that inspired Dexter, right? And And so that's really cool. And I was going to say too, Jamie, like, so if you're looking, I think you should always go looking for lists too. Like you specifically mentioned, like old science fiction, and there's so many great lists out there. The one I've been trying to work through is the SF Masterworks list, and that's on Wikipedia. I think there's a bunch of different places you can find it. It's like 75 books that a few publishers decided should never ever go out of print, and it's a great sort of history lesson. And there's a ton of Philip K. Dick in there, Alfred Bester, just tons. So lists are a great place to start for romance, for example. If you were going to say, well, I'm going to read a romance book, it's a genre I've never read before. I wonder if we could find a list of the greatest romance novels ever written that aren't Jane Austen, and that might be a good place to start to say, like, it's a genre I'm interested in, but how do I make sure that I don't get one of the 9 out of 10 that are crap?
I would ask my mom.
Yeah.
Honestly, like that's what I would do if I was going to try and read, especially because she'd probably point me into some more interesting romance one, like one that I'm not going to read it just because, but my wife did read it recently. But I was watching the show, and I actually recorded. I will watch more of the show. Is Outlander, the Diana Gabaldon one that's been big. It's done amazingly well. It's like one of my mom's favorite series ever, which is it's mostly like it's a historical romancy thing, but it doesn't exactly follow the traditional romance plot per se. There's it's not necessarily all the happy stuff, and it's kind of complicated. There's a bit of time travel and stuff going on.
Well, that's because they have to stretch it out, right?
Well, and that one's book after book after book, right? So I think she's still releasing related books, even like more than a decade later. So
that's one of the things I think probably could be I like series too, and I don't know how much. I'm sure there are romance series out there, but sort of once the tension is gone, it loses all interest, right? And I'll use a TV show as an example. I don't know if you guys ever watched Castle.
No.
The second they sort of resolved the primary sort of relationship between romantic relationship between the two characters on that show, I didn't care anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I was cruising the internet today, and I came across this. It was a pretty cool infograph that showed it showed the total book sales and like what percentage of fiction is different genres, and then it showed within a genre what like the top 10 selling books of all time within each genre are. So I thought that was interesting. Not that the best selling books are necessarily the best, because you've got your 50 Shades of Grey and stuff like that on there, but. But I mean, it's for some of the genres that I was not at all familiar with. That was helpful to me. And then I went to this cool little literary site. I don't know if you guys have heard of, called Wikipedia, and and I just put in literary genres, and I got this list of all the genres, and I was like just looking at it and being like, all right, humor. I don't know if I've read a humor book recently at all, and romance and Western and espionage. It made me think of a lot of these different genres that I wouldn't normally read. So especially now with with so many books out there, like I could read sword and sorcery fantasy for the rest of my life and never get through it all. So I think.
Well, you're reminding me too of some of the other genres that I have enjoyed reading, which is like the Florida crime novels, like the Tim Dorsey and Carl Hyacin, and I want to say, is it Travis McGee? I think it's the Travis McGee books.
Yeah, what's that guy's name? It's McDonald, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. So Florida crime, there's another great genre.
It's funny. I actually. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, JV. Sorry, I interrupted you for a second time.
No. It's funny because when Patrick was asking about how do you, because it's easier to find things tangentially within the genres that you normally read. It's either the lists or the now the also bots and the various different things like that. But for that 1Q84, it popped into my head how I saw it. It's funny. This is the most sort of traditional book markety kind of a thing that's ever probably worked on me. It was a review in the books and arts section of The Economist, where I remembered seeing it. It was because it's a funny thing because it's 1Q84 was the name of it, and then by Haruki Murakami, and I'd read that and I was like, wow, that sounds interesting, and I think I'd recorded it somewhere and forgotten about it for years. And then when I first downloaded Overdrive onto my my tablet, and I was just messing around, I think it popped up there. So it was kind of like seated there in the past, and then it pops up again, and then I'm like, you know what, I'm going to try this out. And the funny thing is, like, it's a big honking book. Like, it's like an epic fantasy sized book, but in the sort of more literary kind of side of things, and with a really, really cool cover, and just the design, the actual book design is spectacular for that book too. It was actually used as an example in one of those book design things, but I had no idea how long it was, because it was one of the first ebooks I read in overdrive, and I wasn't sort of familiar with the way that it was all set up at the time, and it was like, it kept going and going and going, and in a good way. But when I got my wife to read, she's like, holy, like, she did read the whole thing, but she's like, man, that is a long book, but very cool.
What were you going to say, PT?
I'm just going to ask you guys, like, as readers, do you think that you owe it to yourself to try genres if you've never tried them before, or are you happy knowing, like, all right, these are the 4 or 5 genres that I like. I can never get through this whole genre. I'm just gonna stick with this. What's your philosophy on that?
I like hunting around and reading different things. For whatever reason, I enjoy reading. You know, like, my go-to is the science fiction, and I'll always read Vonnegut, and you know, he's probably my go-to author. And Philip K. Dick, but I really enjoy reading all kinds of genres, and I would be willing to try out some that I've never read before because of that. Like, I think, like Michael was saying, like, you never know, right? You have to be open to this stuff, and you know what? You read 20, 30, 50 pages, whatever, and find out that you absolutely hate it. Now you know.
Exactly. You're not really out of anything. I mean, compared to all the books you're going to read throughout your lifetime, what's 30 pages?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I consider myself to be a literary sojourner. I don't stay in one place for very long. You know, I get bored really, really easily, and my attention span it's like that. So if I don't like something, I usually put it down after a couple of pages. So yeah, I don't know. For me, there's just a joy in that journey of just continuing to read stuff you never read before, and I don't know. It just never gets old when you find a really good book.
These days, too, there's really, I mean, I suppose you could say there's never been an excuse with the public libraries and that, because, you know, books have always been free one way or another. But especially today with, like you said, where you can check out a book through Amazon, read the preview or whatever. Same kind of thing. If you want to check out a romance book, what's a buck?
Exactly.
Right, on a Kindle or from the Google Play Store or wherever you want to get them from. Kick a buck, and if you don't like it, you're out $1 in 30 minutes of your time.
And you can get a refund if it's within 7 days.
That sounds like a lot of work. I don't know.
Dude, I read books all the time.
Yeah, I've done it. I haven't done it for any that I've bought intending to buy it, but there's been a couple of times where the missed click, and it's really not that difficult to process. So.
I confess that I may or may not have bought books just to see what they were about and then return them. It's a horrible thing. Makes me a horrible person.
True confessions here.
Yeah,
I would just browse that at the library personally, but yeah.
One of the other things I love about the digital world is the pre-orders. Absolutely love pre-ordering a book and then completely forgetting about it, and you wake up one random morning 3 months later, and your phone says Neil Gaiman or whatever.
It's pretty nice.
I was gonna say, I guess I have a slightly, I have a slightly different take from you guys on that whole, do I owe it to myself, or am I gonna keep exploring that way? Like, anytime I go into the library and see the science fiction and fantasy section, and it's so huge, and I'm just like, wow, there's so, like, or a bookstore, there's so many books that would be interesting to read, and that's just there. If I go to, through different areas where I'm, like, checking out the indie publishing scene in science fiction and fantasy, and some of the stuff that, like, some of the mailing lists that are coming out every day, I'm like, there's something at least moderately interesting almost every day coming through those as well. So and it's not just sort of the narrow, I like this sword and sorcery, or I like this type of epic fantasy. Like, I'm bouncing around. There's so many subgenres, and there's so many completely different things within that I don't know. Like, I'd have to have a really compelling reason from someone else recommending it usually, or some place recommending it, for me to try and go somewhere else, just because I already feel like my to-be-read list just within sort of my core genres, and that's not even getting into, like, the historical fiction side that I haven't gone to in a while. So cool nonfiction stuff as well. So I don't know. I already have, and Michael already said it himself. Like, he has a lot of books sitting there on his Kindle to read, and I do too. And I barely even go to that section of sort of my different to be read piles. So
it's kind of like when you go to the restaurant that you've been to a bunch of times, and you got the one dish that you really like, but you're like kind of tempted. Like, do I want to try something new, or do I want to go with the dish that I know I love? I don't know. But so I could see
more risk in that situation too, though, in the restaurant situation, right? Like,
Sure.
if it sucks, right? You really don't like it. You got to pay again, right? Whereas with a book, especially at the library, there you go.
No, Michael just orders the meal and takes a bite, and if he doesn't like it, he returns it.
Exactly. I just tip the waiter a little extra.
So, any other sort of comments or thoughts on this before we wrap it up?
We do have another comment.
Okay.
Chrissy Moss is watching. Hi,
Chrissy.
Chrissy. And she commented back when we were talking about cutting the National Geographics out, Patrick. And she says, ha ha ha, yes, I did that with the National Geographics. I still love reading those. Don't we all? I still love National Geographics too. And that is all of our comments.
Okay. Anything else? Sounds like we're good. So before we sort of close out the show, PT, do you want to tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about sort of the stuff you write versus what you read, and sort of where the best place or places are for everybody to connect with you online?
Sure, absolutely. My most popular book for sure is Regulation 19, which is kind of a supernatural thriller. It's kind of your classic small town with a secret kind of a story where our main character gets out of jail, goes back to his hometown, and everything's weird, and he doesn't know what's going on, and he's got to kind of figure out what's happening in the town. So that's probably my most popular, and I'm working on the third book in that trilogy right now. And I also just recently released a fantasy novella. There's going to be a series of novellas kind of about this assassin in a fantasy setting. So don't worry, Patrick. It's only like 100 pages, so it's not epic at all. I could check that out. And I also I have a YouTube channel where I review books. I put up like 2 videos a week, and I do weird songs and stuff like that. About like at the end of the year, I did my top I think it was top 20 books of 2014. I did a song about those, and I recently did a song about what to do when your friends call you up on the weekend and want you to do something, but you really want to stay home and read, like what you should do in that situation. So
I keep meaning to show that to my wife, because that would be her.
Very cool. So yeah, you can check out my YouTube channel, or come to pthylton.com. I guess is probably the best place. The central hub.
Hey, and is that are there dashes in that, or is it just straight up?
Just straight up PT Hylton, and it's Hylton with a Y. It's trying to distinguish myself from Paris. So.
Yeah, definitely want to do that.
And
don't want to market confusion.
No. My final plug is I also do host a podcast, which is not book related, but we review documentary films that are streaming on Netflix. So if you want to check that out, it's called the Documentary Review Podcast.
Nice.
Okay, cool. And is that up on iTunes? And
yes.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. This was a ton of fun. If you're ever anyone doesn't show up and you need somebody last minute, hey, track me down. I'll pop on in a second.
Absolutely. And you just if you want to hang on for a couple minutes after the show, we can close up. So to our viewers and listeners, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email at tbrpodcast@gmail.com, and be sure to visit our Goodreads page. The link should be down below. And next week, we will be joined by Johnny B. Truant and Sean Platt, and we're looking forward to that. So have a good week.
Happy reading, everyone.